The Quran is amazing.
Calling the Quran amazing is not something done only by Muslims, who have an appreciation for the book and who are pleased with it. It has been labelled amazing by non-Muslims as well. In fact, even people who hate Islam very much have still called it amazing. One thing which surprises non-Muslims who are examining the book very closely is that the Quran does not appear to them to be what they expected. What they assume is that they have an old book which came 14 centuries ago from the Arabian desert, and they expect that the book should look something like that, an old book from the desert. Well, the Quran does talk about the desert. Some of its imagery describes the desert, but it also talks about the sea, what it's like to be in a storm on the sea. Have you heard of a recent story about a man who was in the merchant marine and made his living on the sea? A Muslim gave him a translation of the Quran to read. The merchant marine knew nothing about the history of Islam, but was interested in reading the Quran. When he finished reading it, he brought it back to the Muslim and asked, "This Muhammad, was he a sailor?" He was impressed at how accurately the Quran describes a storm on a sea. When he was told, "No, as a matter of fact, Muhammad, peace be on him, lived in the desert," that was enough for him. He embraced Islam on the spot. He was so impressed with the Quran's description because he had been in a storm on the sea, and he knew that whoever had written that description had also been in a storm on the sea. The description of a wave over it clouds was not what someone imagining a storm on a sea to be like would have written. Rather, it was written by someone who knew what a storm on the sea was like. This is one example of how the Quran is not tied to a certain place and time. Certainly the scientific ideas expressed in it also do not seem to originate from the desert 14 centuries ago. Many centuries before the onset of Muhammad's prophethood, peace be on him, there was a well-known theory of atomism advanced by the Greek philosopher Democritus. He and the people who came after him assumed that matter consists of tiny, indestructible, indivisible particles called atoms. The Arabs, too, used to deal in the same concept. In fact, the Arabic word dara commonly referred to the smallest particle known to man. Now, modern science has discovered that this smallest unit of matter, that is, the atom, which has all of the same properties as its element, can be split into its component parts. This is a new idea, a development of the last century, yet interestingly enough, this information had already been documented in the Quran, which states, "He, i.e. Allah, is aware of an atom's weight in the heavens and on the earth, and even anything smaller than that." Undoubtedly, 14 centuries ago, that statement would have looked unusual even to an Arab. For him, the dara was the smallest thing there was. Indeed, this is proof that the Quran is not outdated. Another example of what one might expect to find in an old book that touches upon the subject of health or medicine is outdated remedies or cures. Various historical sources state that the Prophet, peace be on him, gave some advice about health and hygiene. Yet most of these pieces of advice are not contained in the Quran. At first glance to the non-Muslims, this appears to be a negligent omission. They cannot understand why Allah would not include such helpful information in the Quran. Some Muslims attempt to explain this absence with the following argument. Although the Prophet's advice was sound and applicable to the time in which he lived, Allah, in his infinite wisdom, knew that there would come later medical and scientific advances which would make the Prophet's advice appear outdated. When later discoveries occurred, people might say that such information contradicted that which the Prophet had given. Thus, since Allah would never allow any opportunity for the non-Muslims to claim that the Quran contradicts itself or the teachings of the Prophet, he only included in the Quran information and examples which could stand the test of time. However, when one examines the true realities of the Quran in terms of its existence as a divine revelation, the entire matter is quickly brought into its proper perspective, and the error in such argumentation becomes clear and understandable. It must be understood that the Quran is a divine revelation. and as such, all information in it is of divine origin. Allah revealed the Quran from Himself. It is the words of Allah which existed before creation, and thus nothing can be added, subtracted, or altered. In essence, the Quran existed and was complete before the creation of Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, so it could not possibly contain any of the Prophet's own words or advice. An inclusion of such information would clearly contradict the purpose for which the Quran exists, compromise its authority and render it inauthentic as a divine revelation. Consequently, there was no home remedies in the Quran which one could claim to be outdated, nor does it contain any man's view about what is beneficial to health, what food is best to eat, or what will cure this or that disease. In fact, the Quran only mentions one item dealing with medical treatment, and it is not in dispute by anyone. It states that in honey there is healing, and certainly I do not think that there is anyone who will argue with that. In the Holy Quran, chapter 16, verses 68 to 70, Allah, the Lord, the one and only God, says, "Your Lord inspired the honeybee, saying, 'Set up hives in the mountains and in the trees and in the trellises that people put up. Then suck the juice of every kind of fruit and keep treading the ways of your Lord which have been made easy. There comes forth from their bellies a drink varied in colours, wherein there is healing for men. Verily there is a sign in this for those who reflect. Allah has created you, and then He causes you to die. Some of you have your lives prolonged to an abject old age, when one loses all knowledge after having acquired it. Allah is all-knowing, all-powerful." The Quran is amazing. If one assumes that the Quran is the product of a man's mind, then one would expect it to reflect some of what was going on in the mind of the man who composed it. In fact, certain encyclopedias and various books claim that the Quran was the product of hallucinations that Muhammad, peace be on him, underwent. If these claims are true, if it indeed originated from some psychological problems in Muhammad's mind, peace be on him, then evidence of this would be apparent in the Quran. In order to determine whether or not there is, one must first identify what things would have been going on in his mind at that time, and then search for these thoughts and reflections in the Quran. It is common knowledge that Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, had a very difficult life. All of his daughters died before him except one. Also, his wife Khadija, of several years, who was very dear and important to him, died at a very critical period of his life. He was used to remember Khadija much during his entire life. Whenever he would slaughter a sheep, he, peace be on him, would send a share to her acquaintances who were still around. Although these examples are only a few of the subjects that would have been on Prophet Muhammad's mind, peace be on him, they are sufficient in intensity to prove the point. The Quran does not mention any of these things, not the death of his children, not the death of his beloved companion and wife, not his fear of the initial revelations, which he so beautifully shared with his wife, nothing. Yet these topics must have hurt him, bothered him, and caused him pain and grief during periods of his psychological reflections. Then these subjects, as well as others, would be prevalent or at least mentioned throughout. The Quran is amazing.